Standing before the colossal stone walls of a medieval castle, you can almost hear the echoes of history, the distant shouts of soldiers, the thunder of trebuchets, and the tense silence before the storm. These fortresses were more than just stone and mortar. They were symbols of power, built to withstand the unimaginable, yet time and again, armies found ways to crack their defenses, turning the tide of entire wars with nothing but cunning, courage, and sheer ingenuity. How did they do it? What hidden strategies turned an impenetrable stronghold into a conquered prize? That's the story we're about to uncover, the secret tactics behind Europe's most legendary castle sieges, where every assault was a high-stakes game of wits and will. Picture this: a besieging army camped outside the walls, staring up at towers that seemed to touch the sky. The defenders had food, water, and the advantage of height, everything they needed to outlast their foes. But the attackers weren't just relying on brute force. They had tricks up their sleeves, from psychological warfare that shattered morale to revolutionary siege engines that reshaped the battlefield. Some commanders starved their enemies into surrender, while others tunneled beneath the walls or launched flaming projectiles to ignite panic. The Siege of Chateau Gaylard in 1204, for example, was a masterclass in deception. King Philip II of France exploited a single overlooked weakness, a forgotten toilet chute, to breach what was thought to be an unconquerable fortress. It's moments like these that reveal the true artistry behind medieval warfare, but this isn't just a tale of destruction, it's a window into human innovation under pressure. Every siege was a puzzle, and the solutions were as varied as the castles themselves. Why did some strategies fail spectacularly while others became the stuff of legend? What can these ancient battles teach us about leadership, creativity, and resilience? As we journey through the smoke and chaos of history's most epic sieges, you'll discover how the smallest detail, a poorly placed gate, a traitor within the walls, or even the weather could decide the fate of kingdoms. By the time we're done, you'll never look at a castle the same way again, so ready your curiosity because we're about to step onto the battlefield and uncover the secrets that change the course of history. The story of castle siege warfare is one of constant adaptation, where every new defense sparked an even more ingenious attack. In the early medieval period, besieging armies often relied on the simplest method of all: starvation. Surround a castle, cut off its supplies and wait, but as castle designs grew more sophisticated, with thicker walls, higher towers, and better stocked granaries, attackers had to think bigger. The result, a technological arms race that reshaped warfare across Europe. Take the Trebuchet, for example, a game-changer in siege weaponry. Unlike earlier catapults, this massive machine could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds with terrifying accuracy, smashing walls from a safe distance. Some trebuchets, like the famous Werwolf used at Stirling Castle in 1304, were so enormous they had to be assembled on site, but defenders didn't just sit back. They countered with reinforced walls, angled designs to deflect projectiles, and even their own artillery. It was a never-ending cycle. Stronger walls led to deadlier siege engines, which then demanded even stronger defenses. Then there was mining, the stealthy art of digging beneath castle walls to weaken them. Attackers would tunnel deep underground, shoring up passages with wooden beams before setting them ablaze. The collapsing tunnels brought sections of the fortress tumbling down unless defenders caught on first. Many castles built listening tunnels where guards could detect the faint scrape of enemy picks. Some sieges became underground battles, with defenders digging counter-tunnels to intercept the attackers in pitch-black clashes beneath the earth. And let's not forget siege towers, hulking wooden structures rolled right up to the walls, letting soldiers swarm over battlements. They were massive targets, vulnerable to fire or counter-siege weapons, but when they worked, they turned the tide in hours. The key was mobility and surprise. At the Siege of Jerusalem in 1089, Crusaders built multiple towers under cover of night, catching defenders off guard. This relentless back and forth between attack and defense wasn't just about destruction, it was about creativity. Every failed assault taught commanders something new, and every breached wall forced builders to innovate. The castles that still stand today are testaments to that struggle, their scars telling stories of sieges lost and won. And as we'll see next, the greatest sieges in history weren't just battles of strength, they were battles of wit, where the smallest oversight could doom a kingdom or crown a conqueror. The most formidable weapon in any siege wasn't a trebuchet or a battering ram, it was fear. Before a single stone was hurled or ladder raised, commanders knew that crushing an enemy's spirit could be as decisive as breaching their walls. Psychological warfare turned the minds of defenders into battlegrounds, where rumors, deception, and sheer terror often did the heavy lifting. Take the siege of Chateau Gaylard, where King Philip II of France didn't just rely on force. He exploited divisions among the defenders, spreading whispers of betrayal and hopelessness until their resolve crumbled from within. A castle's walls might be impenetrable, but the people behind them. They were human, and that was the real weakness. One of the most chilling tactics was the deliberate display of brutality. Armies would stage executions of prisoners in full view of the castle walls, or catapult diseased carcasses over the ramparts to sow panic. The message was clear: surrender or face unimaginable horrors. During the Siege of Jerusalem in 1089, Crusaders marched around the city walls barefoot, mimicking biblical scenes to unnerve defenders with the specter of divine judgment. It wasn't just about physical intimidation, it was theater, designed to make defenders question their chances before the fight even began. Then there were the mind games. Commanders would fake retreats, leaving behind abandoned supplies poisoned or rigged to explode. Some spread false rumors of relief armies being slaughtered or allies defecting, turning hope into despair. The defenders of Carcassonne in 1209 fell victim to this very trick when the attacking army fabricated news that their reinforcements had been ambushed. With morale shattered, surrender came swiftly, but perhaps the most effective psychological weapon was time itself. A prolonged siege with its endless waiting and dwindling supplies wore down even the staunchest defenders. The constant drumbeat of siege engines, the starving faces of children inside the walls, the growing stench of disease, these were the slow, grinding tools that broke spirits. By the time attackers finally struck, many defenders were too exhausted or demoralized to fight back. The siege wasn't just a test of strength, it was a war of nerves, where the side that could outlast the other's fear often emerged victorious. What's striking is how these ancient tactics echo through history. Even today, the principles of psychological warfare, isolation, misinformation, and the erosion of morale remain eerily relevant. Because while castles may have fallen into ruin, the human mind hasn't changed, and as we'll see next, when psychological pressure wasn't enough, attackers turned to an even more audacious strategy: the art of deception, where the line between reality and illusion blurred in the smoke of battle. When all else failed, time became the deadliest weapon in a commander's arsenal. Starvation sieges were wars of endurance, where victory went not to the strongest army, but to the one that could outweigh the other. The Siege of Kenilworth in 1266 dragged on for an astonishing 8 months, transforming England's mightiest fortress into a scene of desperation. Defenders eventually resorted to eating their horses, then dogs, then even rats, anything to survive just one more day. Yet this wasn't just about hunger. A prolonged siege attacked morale, health, and hope itself. Without fresh supplies, disease would spread through crowded corridors. Without clean water, dysentery could kill more than arrows ever could. And as weeks turned to months, Even loyal soldiers would glance at weakening comrades and wonder, was holding out worth dying for? What made starvation so effective against seemingly impregnable castles? Consider the math. While attackers could forage from surrounding lands, defenders were trapped with whatever supplies they'd stockpiled. The mighty Crack des Chevaliers, an imposing crusader fortress, fell in 1271 not because its walls were breached, but because its grain stores ran empty after a 7-month blockade. Even the grandest castles had one fatal flaw: they needed people. Without farmers to tend fields or merchants to bring goods, every barrel of flour eaten was one step closer to surrender. Commanders turned supply management into high strategy. At Harfleur in 1415, Henry V deliberately targeted fresh water sources first, knowing thirst would break defenders faster than hunger. Some besieging armies even allowed women and children to flee besieged towns, not from mercy, but to accelerate the consumption of remaining supplies. The cruel genius, letting non-combatants leave, meant more food for soldiers in the short term, but also deepened despair as families were torn apart, weakening the defenders' will. Yet starvation sieges carried risks for attackers too. Maintaining an encircling army for months drained resources and invited disease in camp. The longer a siege dragged on, the greater the chance relief forces might arrive. That's why the smartest commanders combined starvation with psychological pressure. During the Siege of Orleans in 1429, the English built fortified positions called bastilles not just to blockade the city, but to make escape and hope feel impossible. The message was clear: no one was coming to save them. This slow-motion warfare reveals a surprising truth about medieval conflict. While we remember dramatic assaults with flaming arrows and splintering gates, many more castles fell to silent, invisible enemies' empty bellies, contaminated wells, and the creeping realization that no walls could keep out time itself. The greatest sieges weren't always won by force. They were won by whoever could stare into the abyss of deprivation longest without blinking. Beneath the towering walls of medieval castles, another battle raged, one fought in darkness and silence, where the scrape of a pickaxe could mean the difference between victory and disaster. Mining was the stealthy art of turning a castle's greatest strength, its foundations, into its fatal weakness. Picture teams of laborers, often prisoners or peasants forced into service, digging narrow tunnels by flickering torchlight, shoring up passages with wooden beams as they inch closer to the fortress's heart. Then, with a single well-placed fire, those supports would burn away, causing the tunnel and the ground above it to collapse. Suddenly, a section of the mighty wall would crumble into rubble, leaving a gaping hole for attackers to swarm through. The Siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 became the stuff of legend when King John of England unleashed a terrifying innovation: pig fat. His miners dug beneath the castle's corner tower, packed the tunnel with flammable fat, and set it ablaze. The inferno consumed the wooden supports, and the tower split diagonally, collapsing like a broken tooth. It was a brutal lesson in engineering. The castle's own weight became its downfall. But Rochester wasn't unique. Across Europe, mining turned seemingly invincible fortresses into vulnerable targets. At the Siege of Carcassonne, attackers spent weeks tunneling beneath the walls, only for defenders to discover their scheme at the last moment, leading to a frantic race to dig counter-tunnels and intercept them underground. Defenders weren't helpless, though. Castle designers began incorporating ingenious countermeasures, like deep, water-filled moats that made tunneling nearly impossible, or slanted outer walls to deflect incoming mines. Some castles featured listening galleries, low, vaulted chambers where guards could press their ears to the ground, straining for the faintest sound of digging. At Chateau de Coucy in France, defenders once flooded an enemy tunnel with a diverted river, drowning the miners in their own subterranean trap. The most dramatic clashes happened in the tunnels themselves. Imagine two groups of armed men meeting in a cramped, pitch-black passage, swords clashing by the dim light of a sputtering torch. These underground skirmishes were as much about nerves as skill. One wrong step could bring the ceiling down on everyone. The Siege of Stirling Castle in 1304 saw miners and defenders locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse, with each side collapsing the other's tunnels in a series of subterranean ambushes. What made mining so psychologically devastating was its unpredictability. Defenders never knew where or when the ground might give way beneath them. A castle could hold firm for months, only to collapse overnight because of a single, unnoticed tunnel. It was warfare at its most intimate and terrifying, where victory went not to the strongest army, but to the one that could outthink their enemy in the dark. And as we'll see next, even the mightiest walls were no match for the weapon that combined fire, fear, and sheer destructive force, the Trebuchet. Siege towers were the medieval equivalent of a Trojan horse, a lumbering giant that could turn the tide of battle in a single, terrifying push. Imagine a wooden fortress on wheels, sometimes as high as the castle walls themselves, packed with armed soldiers and slowly rolling toward the enemy. The Siege of Jerusalem in 1099 became a defining moment for these structures when Crusaders, desperate to breach the city's defenses, constructed multiple towers under cover of darkness. By dawn, they were close enough to unleash a storm of arrows and grappling hooks, swarming over the walls like ants, but getting to that moment, that was where the real battle began. Building a siege tower wasn't just carpentry, it was a feat of military engineering. Each one required thousands of pounds of timber, often hauled from forests miles away. The frame had to be sturdy enough to withstand rocks and flaming arrows, yet light enough to move. Some towers were clad in fresh animal hides, soaked in water to resist fire, while others had rotating platforms for archers to pick off defenders. The biggest challenge, mobility. Teams of oxen or hundreds of men would haul these behemoths over uneven ground, sometimes disassembling and reassembling them mid-siege to avoid obstacles. At the Siege of Lisbon in 1147, attackers faced a clever trap. Defenders had littered the approach with caltrops, spiked metal devices that crippled the wheels. The solution: lay down a path of wooden planks, inch by grueling inch. Then came the psychological impact. The mere sight of a siege tower creeping forward could break a defender's spirit. Archers rained arrows from its heights, while soldiers inside waited for the moment the tower's drawbridge slammed onto the enemy walls. But defenders weren't passive either. They'd lob burning pitch onto the structure, or sally out in daring raids to set it ablaze. At the Siege of Tyre in 1124, defenders dug hidden trenches to topple an approaching tower, sending it crashing into a pit of spikes. What made siege towers so audacious was their gamble. They were slow, vulnerable, and resource-heavy, but when they worked, they could end a siege in hours. The Crusaders' success at Jerusalem wasn't just about brute force, it was about timing, cover of darkness, and sheer audacity. And while trebuchets and tunnels chipped away at castles from afar, siege towers did something far more visceral. They brought the fight face to face, turning an impenetrable wall into just another battlefield. There's something primal about the battering ram, a weapon so simple, yet so devastating that it turned castle gates into mere suggestions. Picture a massive log, sometimes reinforced with iron or bronze, swung by dozens of men or suspended in a rolling siege shed. The goal wasn't just to break through, it was to hammer away at a defender's sense of security with every thunderous boom. At the Siege of Lisbon in 1147, battering rams became the centerpiece of a brutal showdown. Attackers cloaked their rams in fireproof hides and built mobile roofs to shield them, but defenders retaliated by pouring boiling oil through murder holes, narrow openings above the gates, turning the rams' advance into a slaughterhouse. What made these weapons so terrifying wasn't just their brute force, it was their inevitability. Unlike trebuchets or mines which could miss or fail, a well-protected ram kept pounding until something gave way. The science behind them was brutally elegant. By concentrating force on a single point, often tipped with metal shaped like a ram's head, hence the name, they exploited the weakest part of any castle, its entrance. Some rams were even suspended on chains within wheeled sheds called tortoises, allowing soldiers to swing them with greater momentum while staying sheltered from arrows and fire. But defenders weren't defenseless. Beyond boiling oil, they dropped heavy stones or hooked poles to snag the ram's frame, tipping it sideways. Some gates were designed with secondary barriers, portcullises that could crash down behind the first breach, trapping attackers in a deadly funnel. At cracked des Chevaliers, defenders once rigged sacks of sand above the gate, releasing them to absorb the ram's blows like a medieval shock absorber. The most ingenious rams, though, were psychological weapons. During the Siege of Acre in 1189, attackers used a hollowed-out ram filled with combustibles. Once it was lodged in the gate, they set it ablaze, burning through the wood while smoke choked defenders inside. It wasn't just about breaking doors, it was about breaking wills, and when that final splintering crack echoed through the fortress, everyone knew the real battle was about to begin. Imagine standing on castle walls as a shadow looms in the distance, a trebuchet arm slowly rising, then snapping forward with a force that sends a boulder hurtling toward you at terrifying speed. These weren't just weapons, they were feats of medieval engineering that turned the tide of sieges across Europe. The secret lay in their counterweight system, a massive box filled with stones or lead, sometimes weighing over 10 tons, mounted on a pivoting beam. When released, that weight dropped, flinging the projectile with deadly precision. At Stirling Castle in 1304, King Edward I's monstrous werewolf could hurl stones the size of millstones, smashing through walls that had stood for generations. But the real genius wasn't just power, it was adaptability. Operators could adjust weights, sling lengths, even projectile angles to hit the same spot repeatedly, turning solid stone into rubble. Defenders had few good options against such force. Archers couldn't reach the crews sheltered behind the machine's frame, and sorties to destroy them were suicide missions through a hail of covering fire. Some castles built outer walls lower than inner ones, forcing trebuchets to waste shots on less critical barriers. Others used angled surfaces to deflect impacts, like the sloped bastions at Carcassonne. But when a trebuchet found its mark, the effects were catastrophic. During the Siege of Acre in 1291, a single well-placed shot collapsed an entire tower, burying defenders under tons of debris. The psychological impact was just as devastating. Unlike mining or starvation, trebuchets struck without warning, a distant creak of winding mechanisms, then sudden annihilation. Attackers sometimes launched more than stones, rotting carcasses to spread disease, burning tar to ignite rooftops, even beehives to unleash chaos. At the Siege of Toulouse in 1218, defenders watched in horror as severed heads of captured comrades arced over their walls. These machines weren't just breaking fortifications, they were breaking spirits, yet trebuchets had weaknesses. Building one required weeks of labor and vast resources, timber from hundreds of trees, ropes as thick as a man's arm. Transporting them meant disassembly and risky reassembly under enemy fire, and they were vulnerable to weather. A sudden rain could swell ropes and render them useless. That's why the greatest commanders used trebuchets as part of a symphony of siege tactics. While Warwolf pounded Stirling's walls, Edward's troops mined beneath them, creating a nightmare where defenders faced destruction from above and below simultaneously. What made these machines legendary wasn't just their destructive power, but their role in a larger story, the relentless innovation of medieval warfare. Every castle design provoked a deadlier siege engine, which in turn inspired stronger defenses. The trebuchet was more than a weapon, it was a symbol of human ingenuity turned toward both creation and ruin, leaving scars on the landscape and history that endure to this day. The Byzantines called it liquid fire, but history remembers it as Greek fire, a weapon so terrifying it could ignite waves and cling to skin like burning tar. Picture a besieged fleet approaching Constantinople's walls, only to face jets of flame erupting from hollow tubes mounted on Byzantine ships. This wasn't ordinary fire. It couldn't be doused with water. In fact, water made it burn fiercer. The exact recipe died with its creators, but historians suspect a volatile mix of quicklime, petroleum, and sulfur that ignited on contact with moisture. During the Siege of Constantinople in 678, Greek fire saved the city twice, incinerating entire Arab fleets with what survivors described as a dragon's breath. The psychological effect was as devastating as the flames. Sailors would leap into the sea only to find the fire chasing them, creating a nightmare where even escape meant agony. But Greek fire was just the pinnacle of pyro warfare. Across Europe, besiegers turned fire into an art form. Flaming arrows were just the beginning. Attackers launched clay pots filled with burning tar from catapults, creating instant firestorms on rooftops. At the Siege of Crema in 1159, defenders watched in horror as incendiary bombs arched over their walls, igniting granaries and choking the air with smoke. Some armies even packed hollowed-out animal carcasses with combustibles, hurling them as biological firebombs. The stench of burning hair and flesh alone could break morale. Defenders had their own fiery tricks. Boiling oil poured through murder holes was a classic, but inventive garrisons mixed in quicklime or heated sand substances that seeped into armor, cooking soldiers alive. During the Siege of Dover in 1216, English defenders repelled French attackers by rolling barrels of burning pitch down the cliffs, creating avalanches of fire. The most cunning trap, fake gates rigged to collapse, funneling enemies into prepared pits where fires were waiting to be lit. What made fire so psychologically potent wasn't just the destruction, it was the chaos. Unlike a trebuchet's predictable bombardment, flames spread unpredictably. One moment a soldier might be holding the line, the next his cloak could erupt in fire. The smoke blinded and suffocated, turning orderly defenses into panicked stampedes, and unlike swords or arrows, fire left survivors hideously scarred, living warnings of its power. The legacy of these weapons echoes today. Greek fire's mystery fuels debates among chemists, while modern flamethrowers owe their origins to medieval ingenuity. But perhaps the most startling revelation is how fire exposed the fragility of stone fortresses. A castle's wooden interiors, beams, floors, even furniture could betray it, transforming mighty walls into ovens for those trapped inside. In the end, the greatest siege weapon wasn't just heat or flame, it was fear, burning brighter than any fire. The mightiest walls could crumble not from catapults or starvation, but from a whisper in the dark, a single traitor turning the tide of history. While armies clashed outside castle gates, another war raged in the shadows, where spies, defectors, and coded messages decided fates as surely as any sword. Take the fall of Constantinople in 1453, where the Ottomans didn't just rely on cannons, they exploited a critical weakness. A poorly guarded gate called the Kirkaport, revealed to them by a defector or possibly even bribed sentries. In that moment, centuries of Byzantine power unraveled because of one overlooked human flaw: trust. Espionage in medieval sieges was far more sophisticated than we often imagine. Networks of informants stretched across enemy lines, from merchants carrying hidden messages to disgruntled servants reporting on grain stores. Bribery was rampant. Gatekeepers, cooks, even nobles could be bought for the right price. During the Siege of Calais in 1346, English spies posed as fishermen to map the city's defenses, while in the Siege of Antioch, crusaders secretly corresponded with a traitor inside the city who promised to unlock a tower gate. The reward: gold, land, or simply survival when the tide turned. But betrayal wasn't always about greed. sometimes it was fear or desperation. In the Siege of Limoges in 1370, the French garrison commander switched sides after witnessing his allies' starvation, deciding surrender was kinder than slow death. Other times grudges festered. The infamous siege of Chateau de Montségur saw a resentful servant guide attackers up a hidden cliff path, bypassing the fortress's impenetrable perch. The most effective spies mastered the art of invisibility. They spoke the local dialect, wore enemy colors, and blended into the chaos of a besieged city. Disinformation was their weapon, spreading false rumors of relief armies or poisoning wells to sow panic. At Rhodes in 1480, Ottoman spies even disguised themselves as monks to scout the knight's defenses. Defenders retaliated with brutal counterintelligence, suspected traitors were thrown from walls, and passwords changed hourly. What's chilling is how these ancient tactics mirror modern warfare. The principles of espionage, recruiting assets, exploiting divisions, and striking where least expected haven't changed, because no matter how thick the walls, human nature remains the weakest link. And in the end, the greatest sieges proved one timeless truth: castles were only as strong as the loyalty of those inside them. While European castles braced for drawn-out sieges, the Mongols rewrote the rules entirely, not with heavier siege engines or deeper trenches, but with something far more terrifying: relentless speed. Imagine an army that could strike faster than warnings could travel, surrounding a city before its gates even closed. This wasn't just warfare, it was a whirlwind of calculated chaos, perfected under Genghis Khan and honed to devastating effect by his successors. At the Siege of Baghdad in 1258, the Mongols didn't just conquer the city, they shattered an empire's illusion of safety in mere weeks. The secret lay in their logistics. While European armies lumbered with wagons and siege towers, Mongol forces traveled light. Each warrior carried multiple horses, rotating them to cover up to 100 miles a day, a distance that would take European forces weeks. Their infamous horse archers could rain arrows while galloping, but their siege tactics were equally revolutionary. Rather than building trebuchets on site, they transported prefabricated parts by camel, assembling them overnight. By dawn, cities like Nishapur found themselves staring down fully operational siege weapons they hadn't known were coming. Deception was their deadliest weapon. At the Siege of Zhengdu, modern Beijing, the Mongols pretended to withdraw, luring defenders into abandoning their posts, only to swing back and scale the undefended walls. Elsewhere, they'd herd prisoners ahead as human shields or light bonfires on distant hills to simulate larger forces. European castles, designed to withstand months of bombardment, were unprepared for an enemy that could appear and strike with such precision. But the true horror was psychological. The Mongols' weaponized reputation, tales of their ruthlessness like the pyramids of skulls outside Baghdad, spread faster than their armies. Many cities surrendered without a fight, believing resistance meant annihilation. Even crack Des Chevaliers, the mighty Crusader fortress, might have faltered against an enemy that didn't play by the rules of chivalry or attrition. What made the Mongols unstoppable wasn't just their tactics, but their adaptability. They absorbed engineers from conquered lands, turning Persian siege expertise against its creators. When rivers blocked their path, they built pontoon bridges in hours. When walls stood tall, they diverted rivers to flood cities or tunneled beneath fortifications using conscripted miners. Traditional castles, reliant on static defenses, were suddenly obsolete against an enemy that treated warfare like a chessboard, always 3 moves ahead. The lesson was clear: in siege warfare, innovation trumped tradition. And as Europe would later discover, the Mongols were just the beginning of a new era where speed and cunning would redefine conquest. Geography was the unseen general in every siege, shaping battles long before the first arrow flew. A castle perched on a windswept cliff, like Mont Saint Michel rising defiantly from the tides, didn't just discourage attackers, it transformed the entire calculus of war. Imagine an army staring up at those sheer rock faces, knowing every approach was a death trap. The sea swallowed supply routes at high tide, while narrow causeworks forced attackers into single-file slaughter. Nature herself became the castle's most formidable ally. Terrain dictated strategy in ways both obvious and ingenious. Take the Crusader fortress of Kerak, straddling a barren desert plateau. Its defenders didn't just rely on thick walls, they exploited the surrounding wasteland. Enemy siege towers, useless without local timber, mining operations. Impossible in solid rock, even Starvation tactics faltered when the castle's cisterns held years of rainwater. Meanwhile, Hungary's Trenčín castle loomed over a single mountain pass, controlling trade routes like a toll booth from hell. No army could bypass it without abandoning their supply lines, making direct assault the only option, and a suicidal one at that, but geography cut both ways. The same cliffs that made Edinburgh Castle impregnable from the north left its southern flank vulnerable, a weakness exploited repeatedly during Scotland's wars of independence. Rivers, while ideal for moats, could betray defenders when drought struck or enemies diverted their flow. During the Siege of Antioch in 1088, Crusaders watched helplessly as Turkish defenders dammed the Oronce River, leaving them parched and desperate. Even island strongholds like Tyre faced catastrophe when besiegers like Alexander the Great simply built a causeway across the sea, turning their aquatic advantage into a prison. The smartest commanders treated terrain as a weapon to be wielded. At the Siege of Masada in 7-3, Roman forces constructed an earthen ramp up the desert fortress's cliffs, an engineering marvel that took months, but rendered the natural defenses moot. Conversely, Welsh castles like Conwy used their rocky perches so effectively that Edward I had to conquer the surrounding land first, starving out defenders by isolating them from local support. What emerges from these battles is a profound truth: the greatest castles weren't just buildings, but extensions of the land itself. Their strength came from symbiosis, the way Dover's white cliffs amplified its walls, or how Carcassone's hilltop position gave its defenders a hawk's eye view. Modern visitors can still feel it standing in their shadows, that prickling sense of awe. That's geography whispering its ancient lesson. In war, the earth itself takes sides. Coastal castles stood as sentinels between land and sea, their fate tied not just to stone walls but to the shifting tides and unpredictable winds. Unlike their inland counterparts, these fortresses faced a double threat: attackers could strike from both directions, turning every siege into a two-front war. The Siege of Tyre in 1124 became the ultimate test of naval siegecraft. Perched on an island just off the coast, Tyre's defenders laughed off conventional assaults. But the Venetians and Crusaders didn't just bring battering rams, they brought ships, ingenuity, and a ruthless understanding of maritime warfare. The challenges of naval sieges started with simple geography. Tides could strand ships or flood trenches dug by besiegers. Storms might wreck entire fleets in hours, as happened to the Mongols attacking Japan in 1281. Even loading siege engines onto ships was a gamble. One rogue wave could send a trebuchet to the ocean floor. At Tyre, the attackers' first hurdle was crossing the shallow strait, separating the island from the mainland. Their solution, a makeshift causeway built from rubble, sand, and even scrapped ships, inching forward under a hail of arrows. It was slow, deadly work, but it turned the sea itself into a road. Yet the real battle began once the ships reached the walls. Naval artillery was crude but devastating: flaming barges rammed into harbor chains, or catapults mounted on decks hurling stones at point-blank range. Defenders retaliated with underwater obstacles, hidden stakes to impale hulls, submerged nets to tangle oars, and chains stretched across harbors to block entry. Tyre's harbor had one such chain, forcing the Venetians to attack it with iron-beaked ships designed to snap the links, but the most ingenious tactic. Turning ships into siege towers, at the Siege of Damietta in 1218, Crusaders lashed vessels together to create floating platforms, archers raining death from above while sappers mined the walls below. Other commanders used ships as mobile bridges, extending gangplanks onto battlements for storming parties. The key was timing, coordinating naval and land forces, so defenders couldn't focus on one threat without exposing themselves to the other. Tyre fell when the attackers finally breached its seaward defenses, swarming in from both directions at once. Naval sieges revealed a brutal truth: no castle, no matter how well designed, could dominate the sea forever. Currents changed, wood rotted, and human ingenuity always found a way. The greatest coastal fortresses like Dover or Gibraltar endured not because they were invincible, but because they adapted, building tidal mills to grind grain during blockades, or carving cisterns into cliff faces to outlast thirst. In the end, the battle for these castles wasn't just fought on walls or waves, it was fought against time itself, as the sea gnawed at their foundations and empires rose and fell with the tide. Faith wasn't just a comfort during medieval sieges, it was a weapon, sharpened by desperation and wielded with theatrical precision. When Crusaders stood starving outside Antioch's walls in 1088, their discovery of the Holy Lance, a spear said to have pierced Christ's side, wasn't mere coincidence. It was psychological warfare at its most potent. Suddenly, emaciated soldiers transformed into zealots, charging gates they'd failed to breach for months. Whether the relic was real mattered less than its effect. Faith turned the tide when arrows and rams could not. Across Europe, sieges became as much about divine intervention as military strategy, with rituals, relics, and prophecies shaping outcomes as decisively as any trebuchet. Religious symbolism permeated every aspect of siegecraft. Before assaulting Jerusalem in 1089, Crusaders fasted and marched barefoot around the city, reenacting biblical scenes to frame themselves as instruments of God's will. Defenders retaliated with their own sacred theater. Muslim garrison leaders at Acre displayed fragments of the true cross on their armor, while Christian knights swore oaths on saintly relics before battle. These weren't just acts of devotion, they were calculated moves to unnerve the enemy. A defender watching invaders kneel in prayer before an assault didn't see piety, he saw men convinced of heavenly backing, fighting with the fury of the damned. Prophecies and visions became tools of command. At the Siege of Orleans in 1429, Joan of Arc's claimed divine guidance shattered English morale. Her insistence that God favored France wasn't just inspiration, it weaponized doubt in enemy ranks. Similarly, during the Reconquista, Spanish commanders timed attacks to coincide with saints' feast days, framing victories as celestial endorsements. Even failed prophecies had power. The mere rumor that a mystic had foreseen a castle's fall could trigger desertions among superstitious troops. The line between faith and fraud was often blurred. Besiegers fabricated miracles, like raining crosses over enemy walls using painted pebbles flung from catapults. Defendants staged fake relic discoveries to rally hope during starvation sieges. At Carcassonne, defenders lowered a statue of the Virgin Mary from the ramparts, convincing attackers their arrows miraculously turned aside until someone noticed the strings pulling it back up. These charades worked because medieval warfare lived in the shadow of the divine, where a single vision could matter more than 1,000 swords. Sacred architecture doubled as military advantage. Castles built around chapels or holy springs became pilgrimage sites, making their destruction a theological scandal. Crac des Chevaliers Chapel was positioned so attackers would have to bombard it first, a PR nightmare for Christian besiegers. Meanwhile, Muslim defenders at Acre used minarets as observation posts, knowing Crusaders hesitated to target them. Faith didn't just fill hearts, it shaped stone and strategy alike. What lingers is how these spiritual gambits reveal warfare's human core. When starvation, disease, and death loomed, even hardened soldiers clung to signs of heavenly favor. The siege of Antioch wasn't won by the Holy Lance, but by the unshakable belief that it granted victory. In the end, the greatest fortress was faith itself, and the most devastating siege engine. The human need to believe the divine was on their side. History often paints medieval warfare as a male-dominated arena, but behind the battlements, women were anything but passive spectators. When castles came under attack, survival mattered more than societal norms, and time after time, women stepped into roles that defied expectations. Take Nicola de la Haye, the formidable castellan of Lincoln Castle during the siege of 1217. At over 60 years old, she didn't just oversee defenses, she commanded soldiers, outmaneuvered rebel barons, and held the fortress until royal reinforcements arrived. Her reward, King Henry III officially named her Sheriff of Lincolnshire, a title almost unheard of for a woman in that era, but Nicola wasn't alone. Across Europe, sieges became moments when necessity tore up the rulebook, and women's contributions shifted from the shadows to the front lines. The chaos of a siege created strange opportunities. With men killed, captured, or away at war, noblewomen like Countess Margaret of Beverley found themselves thrust into leadership. During the siege of Jerusalem in 1187, Margaret didn't just tend the wounded, she donned armor, fought on the ramparts, and later wrote of hurling boiling oil at attackers. Even more startling, her memoir reveals she wasn't exceptional. Other women hauled stones for trebuchets, repaired breached walls under arrow fire, and organized rationing systems to stretch dwindling supplies. In peacetime, these actions might have scandalized society. Under siege, they were celebrated as heroism. Some women wielded influence less visibly, but no less critically. Eleanor of Aquitaine, while not on the battlefield, masterminded sieges through diplomacy and logistics, rallying allies and securing supply routes. Meanwhile, anonymous castle ladies kept garrisons functioning, directing servants, maintaining morale, and even negotiating truces. The siege of Montségur in 1244 saw female Cathars smuggling messages through enemy lines, proving information could be as vital as swords. What's most revealing is how these moments temporarily reshaped gender roles. A woman directing archers from the walls wasn't a rebellion, it was pragmatism. Survival demanded every able hand, and class often mattered more than gender. A noble woman's authority outweighed a peasant man's, and in the crucible of siege warfare, competence trumped tradition. Yet these stories were often downplayed afterward, their deeds folded into male commanders' narratives or erased entirely. The legacy of these women lingers in the stones they defended. Next time you walk through a castle's ruins, look closer. Those scratches on the inner gate, they might be from a countess's dagger sharpened for battle. The chapel where prayers were whispered, perhaps a merchant's wife turned quartermaster counted rations there, because the untold truth of sieges is simple: castles didn't fall or stand because of men alone. They endured because of everyone inside, including the women history forgot to name. Standing atop a castle's battlements, defenders didn't just wait for death to come knocking, they turned their fortresses into death traps. Every archway, every staircase, even the floor beneath an attacker's feet could hide a lethal surprise. Take murder holes, those sinister gaps in ceilings where boiling oil, rocks, or quicklime rained down on intruders. At cracked death chevaliers, defenders dropped incendiary mixtures through these openings, igniting entire waves of attackers in seconds. But the real genius wasn't just the weapons, it was the design. Narrow spiral staircases twisted clockwise to favor right-handed defenders swinging downward, while attackers struggled to raise their swords in cramped spaces. Even the castle's shape played a role. Concentric walls, multiple rings of defense forced enemies to fight through layer after layer, each more deadly than the last. Carcassone's defenders mastered this art during the 1209 siege. When attackers breached the outer wall, they found themselves trapped in a killing zone between two towering curtains of stone, arrows whizzing from every direction. The castle's postern gates, hidden passages meant for surprise attacks, allowed defenders to flank besiegers who thought they'd won, and then there were the psychological touches like the chemin de ronde, a wall walk where sentries could appear suddenly, making garrisons seem larger than they were. A besieging army might spend weeks preparing an assault, only to realize the castle itself was outthinking them at every turn, but the deadliest defenses were often invisible. At Dover Castle, underground tunnels let defenders listen for miners' picks, while at Beaumaris in Wales, tidal moats turned from shallow ditches to drowning hazards with the moon's pull. Even simple features like angled walls deflected boulders from trebuchets, sending them harmlessly into ditches. The lesson was clear: a castle wasn't just a building, it was a living, evolving adversary. And when attackers finally broke through, they often found inner keeps with their own murder holes, boiling oil, and archers waiting behind arrow loops. No victory came without blood. What separated the nearly invincible castles from the easily conquered? Adaptability. The best fortresses, like cracked chevaliers, were constantly upgraded, thicker walls after trebuchets improved, deeper moats when siege towers grew taller. Their builders understood one grim truth: every new weapon sparked a new defense, and survival meant staying ahead of the curve. So the next time you marvel at a castle's grandeur, look closer. Those scars on its stones, they're not just marks of war, they're proof of ingenuity, written in the language of survival. When the gates creaked open and the citizens of Calais filed out barefoot with ropes around their necks in 1347, they weren't admitting defeat, they were playing the last card left in siege warfare: negotiation. Beneath the smoke and clatter of swords, medieval sieges had an often overlooked dimension: the art of diplomacy, where envoys scurried between walls and camps with offers, counteroffers, and sometimes outright lies. Calais became legendary not for its bloodshed, but for its poignant resolution. After 11 months of starvation, 6 burghers volunteered as sacrificial hostages to spare their city, kneeling before King Edward III with the keys to the gates. It was a moment that revealed the brutal calculus of siege negotiations. When swords couldn't decide, human psychology often did. Diplomacy under siege was a high-stakes chess game where every move carried life or death consequences. Defenders might send out envoys under temporary truce flags, their words carefully measured to buy time or scout enemy weaknesses. Attackers, meanwhile, balanced bluster with incentives, promising mercy for swift surrender while whispering of unspeakable fates for resistance. The Siege of Rouen in 1418 showcased this dance. Henry V, despite his reputation for ruthlessness, offered generous terms to starving defenders, knowing a peaceful surrender spared his army months of costly assault. The catch: those terms evaporated the moment his archers knocked their next arrows. Timing was everything. Negotiators knew the best deals came before the first battering rams struck. At the Siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, Scottish defenders parleyed while English trebuchets were still being assembled, securing safe passage before the first stone flew. But wait too long, like the defenders of Béziers in 1209, and negotiations turned dire. Crusader commanders famously declared, "Kill them all, God will know his own," slaughtering 20,000 when the city hesitated. The smartest commanders used diplomacy as a weapon. During the Siege of Orleans, Joan of Arc didn't just rally troops, she sent defiant letters to the English, blending piety with psychological warfare. "Return to your own lands," she warned, "or I will make such a noise as will be remembered forever." Behind the scenes, her envoys sowed discord in enemy ranks, exploiting rivalries between English captains. It wasn't just about saving lives, it was about breaking wills without breaking walls. What's fascinating is how these medieval bargaining tactics mirror modern conflict resolution. The same principles, leverage, bluffing, and the strategic use of mercy still underpin everything from hostage crises to corporate takeovers, because whether in the shadow of castle walls or a boardroom, one truth remains: sometimes the most powerful siege weapon isn't a trebuchet or starving garrison. It's the right words spoken at the right time, by someone sharp enough to know when to deal instead of fight. History remembers the conquerors, but sometimes the most revealing stories belong to those who fell short, not from lack of strength, but from fatal overconfidence. Take the Siege of Malta in 1565, where 40,000 Ottoman troops, backed by the Mediterranean's mightiest fleet, failed to crush a handful of Knights Hospitaller. On paper, it should have been a swift victory. Instead, it became a masterclass in how arrogance turns triumph into catastrophe. The Ottomans arrived with cutting-edge siege guns and seasoned janissaries, but they underestimated Malta's scorching summer heat, which dehydrated their troops faster than wells could be dug. They dismissed the Knights' network of hidden tunnels, allowing defenders to launch devastating nighttime raids. Worst of all, they assumed the island's starving population would collapse, not realizing the Knights had stockpiled years of supplies in underground granaries. By the time Ottoman commanders recognized their mistakes, they'd lost 25,000 men to battle, disease, and sheer exhaustion. The siege collapsed, and Europe gained an invaluable lesson: no army is invincible when it fights blind to its own weaknesses. The same fatal pride doomed the English at the Siege of Orleans in 1429. For months, their fortified positions around the city seemed unshakable, until a 17-year-old peasant girl named Joan of Arc shattered their assumptions. The English had prepared for conventional warfare, not the psychological lightning strike Joan delivered. Her audacious night attacks and unshakable belief in divine mission demoralized seasoned troops who'd never faced an enemy that fought with both swords and symbols. When Joan's forces stormed the pivotal Tourelles fortress, English commanders were still arguing over whether she was a witch, a madwoman, or a genuine threat. Their indecision cost them the siege, and ultimately the war, but perhaps no failure stings more than the Siege of Vienna in 1529, where Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent's army, armed with the largest cannon ever built, marched expecting an easy victory. They didn't account for Vienna's revamped bastion walls, designed to absorb cannon fire. They ignored early autumn rains that turned their camp into a disease-ridden swamp. And they fatally misjudged the defenders' resilience, delaying their final assault just long enough for Polish cavalry to arrive in a thunderous counterattack. The Ottomans retreated in disgrace, leaving behind tents of silk, coffee beans that would launch Vienna's café culture, and a blueprint for how not to conduct a siege. What connects these disasters? A toxic cocktail of overplanning and underthinking. Each conqueror arrived with meticulous strategies for breaking walls, but no contingency for broken morale, shifting weather, or an enemy's unpredictable ingenuity. Modern militaries still study these failures, not for their tactics but for their warnings, because the truth is, sieges aren't won by weapons alone. They're lost by leaders who forget to question their own assumptions and pay the price in blood and glory. Behind every siege's thunderous clash of steel lay a quieter, more relentless foe: empty coffers. Medieval warfare wasn't just waged with swords and trebuchets, it was fought with sacks of silver coins, barrels of grain, and ledger books tallying debts that could cripple kingdoms. Take Henry V's campaign at Harfleur in 1415. His army of 12,000 men consumed 60 tons of food daily, enough to feed a small town for months. By the time the siege ended, England's treasury was gasping, forcing Henry to march toward Agincourt not out of strategy, but sheer financial desperation. Sieges weren't merely military operations, they were monstrous accounting exercises where gold often mattered more than glory. The cost breakdowns were staggering. Building a single trebuchet required hundreds of trees, miles of rope, and teams of specialized carpenters paid by the day. The famous Werewolf at Stirling Castle cost the equivalent of a small palace to construct. Then came the manpower. Mercenaries demanded wages, knights expected spoils, and even peasant levies needed food and shelter. During the Siege of Antioch, Crusader lords secretly sold their armor to buy bread, while at Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans diverted taxes from conquered lands just to keep their massive cannon crews fed. A prolonged siege could drain a kingdom's wealth faster than any battlefield defeat. This financial pressure reshaped strategy at every level. Smart commanders targeted harvest seasons, knowing crops could feed their troops while starving defenders. Others, like Edward III during the Hundred Years' War, perfected the chevauchée, raising enemy farmland not just to weaken foes, but to fund their own armies through plunder. Sieges often ended not because walls fell, but because one side ran out of coins. The Siege of Rouen saw French defenders eating rats while English attackers, equally broke, resorted to melting church silver to pay their troops. Bankers became unsung warlords. Italian moneylenders like the Medici financed entire campaigns with interest rates that could spark rebellions back home. When Frederick II besieged Milan in 1236, his credit line with Florentine bankers collapsed mid-siege, forcing humiliating retreat. Conversely, the wealth of Burgundy's dukes let them sustain sieges for years, outspending rather than outfighting enemies. The cruelest irony, victories could be as ruinous as defeats. After capturing Chateau Gaylard, Philip II of France spent more rebuilding it than the siege itself had cost. These financial aftershocks ripple through history. Debts from sieges fueled tax revolts, royal bankruptcies, and even dynastic collapses. Because in the end, the true measure of a siege success wasn't just who held the castle, but who could still afford to stand in its walls. Hollywood loves a good siege, the flaming arrows, the battering rams, the hero standing alone on the walls against impossible odds. But peel back the cinematic spectacle, and you'll find history's truth is far stranger than fiction. Take Game of Thrones' Battle of Blackwater, where wildfire obliterates an entire fleet in a green inferno. Dramatic, absolutely, but it's not far from the real Greek fire used by Byzantines, a substance so lethal it burned on water and clung to skin like napalm. The difference: real medieval commanders couldn't conjure it at will. Recipes were state secrets, lost to time, and deploying it required meticulous timing and luck. Then there's the myth of the lone hero turning the tide. Films love a scene where one warrior, Aragorn at Helm's Deep, Maximus in Gladiator, single-handedly rallies defenders. In reality, sieges were grueling team efforts. The defenders of Stirling Castle didn't rely on charisma. They rotated shifts on the walls, maintained supply lines, and repaired breaches under cover of darkness. Even Joan of Arc, often painted as a solitary visionary, depended on engineers, diplomats, and thousands of anonymous soldiers to lift the siege of Orleans. Hollywood also gets sieges fast. Movies compress months of starvation into a single climactic assault. The truth: most sieges were wars of attrition. The Siege of Harfleur dragged on for 6 weeks before Henry V's forces even breached the walls, and that was considered quick. Defenders didn't just stand around waiting. They launched nighttime raids, sabotaged siege engines, and negotiated secret truces to buy time. And forget the tidy Hollywood ending where the good guys win because they're good. History's sieges were won by logistics, disease, or sheer exhaustion as often as bravery. The Mongols didn't take Baghdad because they fought harder. They won because they outlasted everyone else. Perhaps the biggest fiction, the idea that castles were invincible until plot armor cracked. In Lord of the Rings, Minas Tirith's walls seem impregnable until the enemy arrives with a few ladders. Real sieges rarely hinged on one weak spot. cracked death chevaliers survived decades of attacks because of layered defenses, concentric walls, hidden tunnels, and psychological tricks to make garrisons seem larger. When it finally fell, it wasn't due to a heroic charge but a forged letter convincing defenders their own king had ordered surrender. So why does pop culture get it wrong? Drama demands clarity, clear heroes, visible stakes, and swift resolutions. Reality was messier, sieges where both sides starved equally, where dysentery killed more than swords, and where victory often went to whoever could afford to keep fighting. But next time you see a castle under siege on screen, look closer. The real story isn't in the flaming arrows or the final charge, it's in the shadows, where farmers turned, soldiers patched walls with rubble, where scribes tracked dwindling grain stores, and where the true siege was fought not just with steel, but with stubborn, unglamorous endurance. The echoes of medieval siege warfare reverberate far beyond crumbling castle walls. They shaped the very DNA of modern combat. Take blockades, the ancient tactic of starving enemies into submission. Today's naval quarantines and economic sanctions operate on the same principle: isolate, exhaust, and compel surrender without a single arrow fired. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. naval blockade wasn't just about stopping ships, it was a psychological gambit straight from the siege playbook, pressuring the Soviets through controlled deprivation. Even cyber warfare adopts this logic, with digital blockades cutting off access to critical infrastructure, just as medieval armies poisoned wells or burned fields. Psychological warfare, refined in the shadow of castle walls, now dominates modern conflict. The whispers of traitors and staged displays of brutality have morphed into drone strikes live-streamed for maximum terror, or AI-generated deepfakes sowing chaos behind enemy lines. In World War II, British operatives dropped forged ration cards over Nazi-occupied Europe to spark infighting. A direct descendant of the fake surrender notes medieval commanders slipped into besieged cities. The tools have changed, but the goal remains identical: break the enemy's will before breaking their defenses. Then there's tunneling, the stealthy art of undermining fortifications. From Vietnam's Cu Cai tunnels to Hamas's labyrinthine networks beneath Gaza, the underground battlefield would feel eerily familiar to medieval miners. Modern armies even use ground-penetrating radar, the high-tech equivalent of listening galleries, to detect subterranean threats, and just as medieval sappers ignited fires to collapse tunnels, today's militaries deploy thermobaric bombs that suck oxygen from underground hideouts. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is adaptability. Medieval commanders iterated defenses against each new siege engine, just as modern militaries develop countermeasures against drones or hypersonic missiles. The castle's concentric walls evolved into layered missile defense systems, while Trebuchet's precision targeting finds its echo in smart artillery guided by satellites. Even the concept of hearts and minds campaigns traces back to sieges where the loyalty of townspeople decided outcomes as surely as any rampart. The lesson: however advanced our weaponry, conflict still hinges on the same human factors: fear, ingenuity, and the relentless pursuit of advantage. When a Ukrainian drone operator spots a Russian trench, or a hacker infiltrates a power grid, they're waging a war that would make medieval sappers and archers nod in grim recognition. Because while castles may have fallen, the art of siege outthinking, outlasting, and outmaneuvering never really disappeared. It just put on new armor. Beneath the quiet fields and crumbling ruins of medieval Europe, the earth still holds echoes of ancient sieges, hidden tunnels snaking toward long-fallen walls, iron arrowheads fused into scorched stone, and the silent rows of skeletons with blades wedged between ribs. Archaeology doesn't just uncover these fragments, it stitches them back into stories. Take the recent discovery at the Siege of Kenilworth, where ground-penetrating radar revealed a network of sapper tunnels beneath the castle's moat. Some collapsed intentionally, others filled with the bones of miners caught in underground counterattacks. Each artifact is a cipher. A broken trebuchet counterweight found in France still bears grooves from its ropes, telling us exactly how it was wound. A mass grave outside Vienna's walls, with skeletons clustered around a single arrowhead, hints at a desperate last stand against Ottoman archers. But the real revelations come from the smallest details. At the Siege of Chateau Gaylard, archaeologists sifting through latrine pits found fish bones and berry seeds-proof defenders resorted to scavenging the moat and nearby forests as starvation set in. At Caerlaverock Castle in Scotland, cracked mortar mixed with animal hair, a medieval binding agent shows where defenders frantically patched breaches between assaults. Even weather leaves clues. Soil layers at Harfleur show weeks of relentless rain turned siege camps into quagmires, explaining why Henry V's cannons constantly misfired. The most haunting finds, though, are the personal relics: a child's wooden toy dropped in a fleeing crowd stampede, a scribe's half-finished letter buried under collapsed rubble, a crusader's flask still smelling of vinegar after 8 centuries. These aren't just objects, they're frozen moments. At Crac des Chevaliers, a single rusted key found near a postern gate suggests a traitor's handoff, while at Montségur, Cathar charms hidden in wall crevices whisper of clandestine faith under siege. Technology is rewriting siege narratives too. LiDAR scans at Tintagel revealed hidden approach roads attackers used to haul siege engines, invisible to the naked eye. DNA analysis of bones at Toten exposed gruesome truths. Many soldiers were malnourished teenagers, drafted from starving villages, and at Constantinople, chemical traces on the Theodosian walls confirm where Ottoman cannon fire hit hardest, pinpointing the exact weak spots Maimed the Conqueror exploited. What emerges isn't just a chronicle of violence, but a testament to ingenuity. A broken pulley system in a Spanish castle's well shows defenders rigged buckets to keep drawing water under arrow fire. Charred grain stores in Rouen prove someone risked flames to salvage one last meal. Every excavation peels back another layer of human stubbornness, the refusal to yield, even when hope crumbled like the walls around them. Archaeology doesn't just dig up the past, it forces history to breathe again, one shattered shield, one desperate scratch on stone at a time. Picture this: a sprawling castle rises before you, its high walls dotted with archers, its gates barred with iron. You've got 5,000 men, a month's worth of supplies, and one goal: to take the fortress before winter strikes. Do you starve them out, build towering siege engines? Or hatch a scheme so audacious no one sees it coming? Let's step into the mind of a medieval commander, where every choice could mean glory or ruin. First, assess the castle's weaknesses. That imposing gatehouse, it might seem like the obvious target, but seasoned defenders will have murder holes and boiling oil waiting. Instead, your scouts notice the eastern wall sits on older foundations, slightly uneven, a potential vulnerability for mining. Or perhaps the castle's well is fed by an underground spring, vulnerable to poisoning or diversion. Time is your enemy, though. A prolonged siege risks disease in your camp or enemy reinforcements riding to the rescue. Now consider deception. History's greatest siege masters thrived on misdirection. You could feign retreat, leaving behind barrels of abandoned wine laced with laxatives. Or spread rumors among the defenders that their lord has already surrendered, sowing dissent. The Byzantines perfected the art of fake defectors, sending deserters to feed false plans to the enemy. But deception is a gamble. One captured spy could reveal your scheme, turning your trickery into their triumph. What about technology? Trebuchets are iconic, but building one takes weeks and countless resources. Maybe a faster solution lies in fire. Greek fire, if you have it, could panic defenders into mistakes, or construct makeshift incendiary arrows to ignite rooftops under cover of darkness. But remember, castles were designed to burn slowly, with stone partitions to contain fires. Your flames might buy time, but not victory. Then there's the human factor. Inside those walls, people are your greatest leverage and unpredictability. Could you exploit tensions between the garrison and townsfolk, bribe a disgruntled guard to leave a postern gate unbarred, or target the defenders' morale, catapulting rotting carcasses or the heads of their fallen comrades over the walls? Psychological warfare wins sieges as surely as any battering ram, but push too hard, and you might unite them against you in desperate defiance. Now, the clock is ticking. Your scouts report enemy cavalry 2 weeks away. Do you gamble on an all-out assault, accepting heavy losses for a swift victory, or double down on patience, trusting starvation and disease to do your work? There's no perfect answer, only consequences. Attack too soon and your men become pincushions for archers. Wait too long, and winter's frost could claim more lives than any arrow. This is the siege commander's dilemma, a chess game where every move risks lives, and the board itself fights back. The best strategists blended ruthlessness with ingenuity, like Edward I at Stirling, who combined trebuchets with targeted mining to collapse walls from below while bombardment rained from above. Others, like Saladin at Kerak, won without striking a single blow, using whispered threats and generous terms to coax surrender. So, what's your move? The castle's fate and your legacy hangs in the balance, because in the end, sieges weren't just about breaking gates. They were about breaking wills, outthinking the enemy, and sometimes recognizing the moment to offer mercy instead of slaughter. The greatest commanders knew victory wasn't just in taking the castle, but in knowing how. The ink-stained pages of medieval chronicles hold more than just dates and battles. They pulse with the raw terror and stubborn hope of those who lived through sieges. Take the Siege of Orleans, where a French soldier's letter describes the eerie silence before Joan of Arc's arrival. No birds sang over the walls, only the creak of English siege engines and the sobbing of children too weak to cry louder. Another account, scribbled by a friar hiding in the cathedral cellar, tells of defenders chewing leather belts for sustenance, their teeth worn down to nubs. These aren't dry historical records, they're survival narratives etched in desperation. One of the most chilling first-hand accounts comes from the Siege of Antioch during the First Crusade. A knight named Raymond of Aguilers wrote of soldiers gnawing on tree bark and paying 5 silver pieces for a single rat, only to vomit it up later from starvation. But it's his description of the night the city fell that chills the blood. We waded through streets slippery with blood, our lanterns reflecting in the eyes of hiding Turks like wolves in the dark. Contrast this with the diary of a Muslim defender, Usama ibn Munki, who recounted crusaders tossing severed heads over the walls with catapults, each one wrapped in cloth like some grotesque gift. The Siege of Jerusalem in 1089 left equally vivid scars in the historical record. A Christian chronicler, Fulcher of Chartres, described mothers trading jewels for a handful of barley, only to have it stolen by their own soldiers. Meanwhile, an anonymous Jewish survivor's letter, discovered centuries later in a Cairo synagogue, tells of families jumping from rooftops to avoid conversion, their bodies piling up in the alleys. These accounts don't just document events, they expose the fractures in humanity when survival hangs by a thread. Even rarer are the voices of women. At the Siege of Montségur, a Cathar woman named Esclarmonde de Foix smuggled out a letter hidden in a loaf of bread. They burned our books first, then our homes. Now the snow tastes like ash. Her words, preserved by sheer chance, remind us that sieges weren't just clashes of armies, but erasures of entire ways of life. What makes these fragments so powerful is their intimacy. Official chronicles might record troop movements or treaty terms, but personal letters reveal the scent of smoke clinging to clothes, the way hunger gnawed at minds as fiercely as bellies, or the surreal moments of beauty like the Burgundian mercenary who wrote of watching roses bloom in a besieged courtyard, their petals drifting over corpses. These details, fleeting and unpolished, bridge the centuries. They force us to confront the truth. Behind every siege tactic, every splintered gate or shattered wall, were people who laughed, loved, and wept until history swallowed them whole. Now their parchment whispers remind us that war isn't waged on landscapes, but in the hearts of those who endure it, and perhaps that's the greatest siege of all, the one against forgetting. Popular culture loves to paint medieval sieges with dramatic strokes, defenders dumping cauldrons of boiling oil onto hapless invaders, trebuchets landing boulders with sniper-like precision, and castle walls crumbling after a single heroic charge. But peel back the layers of myth, and you'll find reality is far more fascinating and often far less cinematic. Take the infamous boiling oil trope. While it makes for thrilling movie scenes, historical records suggest it was rarely used. Oil was expensive, difficult to source in large quantities, and risky to heat in the chaos of battle. Instead, defenders often relied on cheaper, more readily available alternatives: boiling water, heated sand, or quicklime, a caustic powder that could blind and choke attackers. At the Siege of Dover in 1216, chroniclers noted defenders pouring molten lead from the walls, but even that was a desperate improvisation. Lead was precious, and no commander would waste it unless facing absolute disaster. Then there's the legend of trebuchet precision. Films often show these massive machines hitting specific targets like medieval artillery, but the truth is messier. Trebuchets were more like area denial weapons, effective for pounding walls or spreading chaos in courtyards, not for picking off individual soldiers. Accounts from the Siege of Stirling Castle reveal crews spent days adjusting ropes and counterweights just to land a single shot close enough to damage a wall segment. Accuracy improved with practice, but even the famed Werewolf's operators couldn't guarantee where its projectiles would land. The real terror of trebuchets wasn't their precision, it was their unpredictability. A boulder might miss the gatehouse but collapse a stable, igniting panic as horses stampeded through the fortress. One of the most stubborn myths, the idea that castle moats were always deep, crocodile-infested death traps. In reality, many moats were shallow ditches, sometimes dry, designed more to slow attackers and undermine siege towers than to drown them. The moat at Kenilworth Castle, for instance, was only waist-deep in places enough to bog down armored knights, but hardly a watery grave. As for crocodiles, medieval Europe had no native populations, and importing exotic reptiles would have been laughably impractical. Defenders preferred simpler, grislier deterrents: sewage. Many moats doubled as latrines, creating a festering hazard for anyone with an open wound. Even the classic image of knights storming breached walls is ripe for re-evaluation. Full-plate armor, while imposing, was a liability in close-quarters combat atop narrow battlements. Many siege accounts describe knights stripping down to lighter mail or padded gambesons to avoid overheating or getting tangled in fallen comrades. And forget the Hollywood trope of defenders rolling boulders onto attackers. Most castles stored rocks for trebuchets, not manual pushing. The real killers were much quieter: crossbow bolts from arrow loops, or the sudden collapse of an undermined section of flooring, sending armored men crashing into pits lined with stakes. So why do these myths persist? Because they simplify the chaos of siege warfare into tidy, adrenaline-packed moments. The truth, a mix of logistics, ingenuity, and sheer endurance, doesn't always fit neatly into a 2-hour epic. But next time you see a castle under siege on screen, remember, the real story isn't in the boiling oil or the perfect trebuchet shot. It's in the unglamorous details: the quicklime dust stinging defenders' eyes, the sapper's blisters from weeks of digging, the silent terror of watching your last barrel of grain empty. These are the untold sieges, where history was made not by grand gestures, but by stubbornness, scarcity, and the occasional stroke of brutal creativity. The Siege of Constantinople in 1453 wasn't just a battle, it was a brutal symphony of innovation, desperation, and world-changing consequences. Picture this, a city that had repelled invaders for over 1,000 years, its massive Theodosian walls standing unbroken through 20 previous sieges. Now against the young Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, those same walls faced something unprecedented: monstrous cannons capable of hurling stone balls weighing half a ton. The largest, nicknamed Basilica, took 60 oxen and 400 men just to transport it into position, but this siege wasn't won by firepower alone. It was a masterclass in adaptation, where every failed assault taught Mehmed a new way to dismantle the impossible. Take the Ottoman Navy's initial disaster. Byzantine defenses blocked the Golden Horn with a massive iron chain, trapping Mehmed's ships outside the harbor. Most commanders would have accepted this setback. Not Mehmed. In a stroke of genius, he ordered his fleet dragged overland, on greased wooden tracks, for nearly 2 miles, bypassing the chain entirely. Overnight, 70 ships appeared behind Byzantine lines, their sails looming like ghosts over the city's weakest northern walls. The psychological shock was as devastating as the tactical advantage. Now defenders had to split their dwindling forces, guarding both land and sea approaches under relentless bombardment, yet the real turning point came from an overlooked flaw in Constantinople's legendary defenses. The city's outer walls were protected by a deep moat, except near the Blascherny Palace, where the terrain made digging impossible. Mehmed's spies knew this. For weeks his cannons pounded adjacent sections, drawing defenders away from this vulnerable spot. Then, on the night of May 29th, he launched a final, multi-pronged assault. First, expendable conscripts swarmed the walls to exhaust the Byzantines. Next, elite janissaries struck the weakened Blascherny sector, and in the chaos, a small postern gate was left unlocked. Whether by oversight or betrayal, no one knows. Janissaries poured through, flanking defenders from within their own fortress. The siege's aftermath rewrote history. Mehmed's use of gunpowder artillery rendered traditional high walls obsolete overnight, sparking a revolution in fortress design across Europe. But the real lesson lay in his relentless flexibility. When cannons cracked walls but couldn't secure victory, he turned to psychology, flying his flag over breached sections to demoralize defenders. When naval blockades failed, he reinvented mobility, and when brute force stalled, patience and deception finished the job. Constantinople didn't fall because its walls failed. It fell because Mehmed refused to accept that they couldn't. From trebuchets to treachery, medieval sieges were a breathtaking display of human ingenuity and endurance, where brute force met psychological warfare, and desperation sparked invention. These weren't just battles, they were high-stakes puzzles where every solution created new challenges. The Ottomans dragging ships over land to bypass Constantinople's defenses, the Crusaders starving inside Antioch's walls only to triumph through sheer grit, the cunning whispers that turned allies into traitors. Each siege rewrote the rules of war. What's astonishing isn't just the scale of destruction, but the creativity born from it. Castles evolved thicker walls to counter trebuchets, so attackers dug tunnels. Defenders poisoned wells, so besiegers diverted rivers. Every innovation forced another, leaving behind blueprints for modern warfare. But beyond tactics, sieges reveal something deeper about us. They were battles of wills as much as weapons, where starvation and fear could break armies faster than any sword. The Siege of Kenilworth showed how hunger gnawed at loyalty, while Chateau Gaylard proved even the mightiest fortress could fall to a single overlooked shoot. These stories aren't just about conquest, they're about resilience, desperation, and the fragile line between victory and surrender. So the next time you stand before a castle's ruins, listen closely. Those scars on its stones, they're not just marks of war, they're lessons. lessons about preparation, about adaptability, and about the unyielding human spirit that built and broke these stone giants. Which siege lingers in your mind? Was it the thunder of Warwolf stones at Stirling, or the silent betrayal that cracked Constantinople's gates? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're hungry for more tales of history's most epic showdowns, hit that subscribe button. Because the past isn't just a story, it's a mirror, reflecting the brilliance and brutality that still shape our world today.